Welcome to Chapter 27. This chapter is a loose ends kind of chapter. It works with things like comparatives, which we'll discover what they are in a second, conjunctions, which are critically important for linking major sections of the New Testament together, linking paragraphs as well as sentences together, and being structural markers that indicate things that are about to change. So the conjunctions are fairly important structurally. And then adverbs, a little section on adverbs, although we've worked with adverbial usages of the participle and infinitive already. We'll look at some of the variety of the way adverbs and adverbial phrases and clauses are used. And then finally, in this course so far, we've focused on words. We've worked with nouns and the 2-1-2 nouns and 3-1-3 settings and adjectives, and we've worked with verbs in all their various tenses and moods and infinitives and participles, different forms. We've worked with pronouns, personal pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, relative pronouns, etc. And now we're moving away from the word level up to a clause level. We've done that a little bit already with the prepositional phrases, but now we'll move to the clause level, largely as a way to indicate the moving beyond the word level and seeing things as bigger units. The clause level is just on the next step up to the sentence, the paragraph, and the discourse. Well, we'll begin that journey with the clauses, and because context determines meaning, the bigger units are going to have a major effect on how the individual words are understood. So this will be a kind of an eye-opening chapter, hopefully, and let's get started. Let's begin with looking at comparatives and superlatives. In English, we're very familiar with this comparative and superlative distinction. We've got things like good, better, that's comparative, and best, which would be the superlative. We've got small, smaller, comparative, and smallest, superlative. Other things like great, greater, greatest. And you can see we usually add for the comparative the ER form, bigger. And then for the superlative form, we add the EST, biggest. Great, greater, greatest, comparative, superlative. Comparative usually compares two items, and so you say this is greater or bigger than that. You're usually comparing two items when you use a comparative with the ER. And the superlatives compare more than two, so this is the biggest of the whole group. And so basically that's the distinction we make in English with the ER ending for comparative, the EST for superlative, the comparative comparing two items, the superlative saying it's the greatest or least of the three or more items of the group that we're comparing it with. So these are comparatives and superlatives and how they work in English. Pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, it won't be that straightforward in Greek. Now, starting out in Greek, I want to be honest with you about the ambiguities there are with these comparatives and superlatives. So the Greek comparative may function as one of the three of the following. A regular adjective. It can also function as a superlative sometimes. And so you say, well, is it a comparative or a superlative? Well, sometimes the comparative can function as a superlative. And then it can also function as what's called an elative. And this is an intensified adjectival sense. Usually we use the word very, so you'd say very great. Instead of saying the greater or greatest, you'd say very great or very many, that type of thing. The elative, an intensifier. Similarly, the superlative may function as a regular adjectival, an elative itself, or it may function as a comparative. And so there's some ambiguity, and the context is going to have to sort out whether the superlative is taken in a comparative sense, etc., or vice versa. So let's first look at the comparatives. Now the comparative in Greek uses the on ending or the
teros aon
ending. So for example, in megas, great, and
mikros,
small, to become greater, the comparative, you'd say medzon, adding an omega nu on the end of megas. So it's medzon, means greater.
mikros,
On the other hand, small becomes smaller by adding the
teros
in the end. So it's
mikroteros,
means smaller. And so that's how the comparative is formed, with the on or
teros
ending placed on great or small. There's another way a comparative can be made, and that is with the little particle a. And it's frequently, we've translated or other places, but it can be translated than. So somebody would say, this is greater than that. And there's a comparison then being made between one object or one thing and another, comparing them using this than statement, this a, the eta, in Greek. So this is a couple ways the comparative is formed and used, and we'll look at the elative next. The comparative is sometimes used as an elative or an intensifier rather than a strict comparative. So for example, in Acts 13:31 we have
hos
ophthe epi hemeros pleus, who, the relative has, appeared, the verb form there, for very many days. Hemeros is days. Pleus is actually the comparative form of
polus,
which means many. But they use the comparative here in an elative sense, intensifying it, so it's for very many days, which is called the elative use of the comparative as an intensifier, very many. Now the Greek comparative can also be used as a superlative. So for example, in Luke 9:48, we have
ho mikroteros,
pasin humin estin megas. It means the least.
mikroteros,
It's not the lesser, it's the least among you, among all of you, is the greatest, is the megas. And so you see here that the teros ending, which should be comparative, actually is used in the sense of the least, which is a superlative. The comparative can also be used kind of as a regular adjective, which sometimes almost acts like a substantive itself. And in Matthew 12:6 we have lego humin
hoti,
tu hiru medzon estin hoda. So I say to you that one greater medzon, one greater than the temple, is here. Estin hoda is here. So the medzon here is taken almost like an adjective that's used almost substantively here, as the great one, one greater than the temple. Still has a comparative sense to it, but is used almost like an adjective here. So these are the various usages of the comparative, and we'll look a little bit further and see how they're formed next. Now the comparatives are taken as adjectives almost and just declined with the normal, for example, third declension noun form with medzon. So medzon becomes
medzonos, medzoni, medzona, medzones,
etc. So using the third declension endings there. There are other comparatives that we can look at. We've got
agathos,
which means good. Kreson means better. So you can see these are almost like second aorist comparatives where the root changes. It's not just a matter of adding the omega noon ending, but the actual root changes from good
agathos,
to kreson, better.
polus,
Much, or many, becomes pleon, more. And
kakos,
which means bad, becomes kreon, worse. And so you can see the omega nu ending on kind of adds a comparative element to the root adjective here. Now for the Greek superlatives, they are often formed by putting a
tatos,
on the end,
tatos eon,
or an
histos eon,
on the end. So we have
mikros,
little. To say less, we would say elason. And to say least, we'd say
elakistos.
So you see the istas ending there goes to least. So these endings are tagged on to the superlatives to indicate it.
Tatos,
The istas, the same way the on ending and the teras ending were placed in the comparatives. Some other superlatives are
hupsistos eon,
which means the highest, and pleistos, which means the most, or the mostest, the most. Another one is
neos,
which means new. It becomes
neoteros,
which is newer, and then it becomes
neotatos,
the newest. And so it has the
tatos,
ending on, indicating that it's a superlative. Now the different usages of the superlative, it can be taken, of course, as a superlative, the greatest, the biggest, whatever, but it can also be understood as an elative. So, for example, in Mark 4:1, we have
sunagatai pros auton oklos pleistos.
The
pleistos
is a superlative, but it's not taken as a greatest crowd, the
oklos pleistos,
but a very great crowd. And so it's used in an elative sense there, which intensifies it rather than making it a superlative in a normal EST kind of greatest kind of way. It was just a very great crowd gathered together
pros auton
before him. The superlative can also be taken as a comparative. And in Matthew 21:28 we have
anthropos eken tekne duo kai proselthen to proto apen.
a man had 2 sons. He came to the first, proto, the first, usually a superlative terms, the first of many, first, and said, but here there's only 2 elements, 2 sons, and so it's a comparative. He came to the first as opposed to the second. So that's how we work with the superlatives and the comparatives. And we've seen that the comparatives can be taken as superlatives and also an elative way, or as a strict comparative, or the superlatives, which also can be used comparatively and taken as elatives or as superlatives. We notice the endings on the comparative were on,
teros,
and on the superlative were
istos, tatos.
And so these are just working with some of the comparatives and superlatives, and you should be aware of the diversity of ways in which they can be used in actual contexts. Sometimes it can be ambiguous, but most of the time the context will sort these out for us. Now let's take a look at the adverbs. In English, usually we make a adverbial form by adding the ly onto the end of an adjective. So he went, we don't say he went quick, we said he went quickly. And the ly ending tells us that the quickly modifies the verb went rather than it was a quick car or it was a quick rabbit. In that case, the quick would modify those nouns, be an irregular adjective. When we add the ly, it sends it over to a verb. So it's called an adverb. An adverb then modifies the meaning of the verb. In Greek, we've already seen this a couple ways in terms of the adverbial participle. And so we have, after leaving the store, they went home. After leaving the store modifies and tells you when they went home. And so it actually is a temporal modifier of the verb, giving you a more clear indication of the time of the verb. After leaving the store, they went home. Antecedent action here. After leaving the store is antecedent to them going home. The articular infinitive can also be used in this adverbial sense. So before Philip called you, using an infinitive, I saw you, under the whatever. So again, the articular infinitive with the various prepositions, we've got pro, prin, and some of the prepositions that are of temporal nature, they will modify the verbs. And so we've already looked at some adverbial usages in the participle and in the infinitive. The adjective now, with an omega noon ending in the genitive plural, is changed to an adverb by adding the omega sigma ending. So, for example, kalon, notice how you take the genitive plural form, which means good, is taken over to an adverb as kalos, which means well. So you do not say, they did good. Good is an adjective, and so it doesn't modify did. You say they did well, because well is an adverb and modifies the verb. So they did well, not they did good. There are several other ways these adverbs are triggered, and we'll look at those next. Now you have what are called adverbial prepositions. And so words like exo are an adverb or preposition meaning outside. Opiso also is taken as an adverb meaning behind. In another context, it'll function as a preposition meaning after. So you've got this linking between prepositions and adverbs that happen. Prepositions, there are many more prepositions than there are adverbs, but some of the prepositions will do double duty as kind of have this adverbial use. Now there are strict adverbs also. There are adverbs of time, manner, and place. And so adverbs of time would be like
Arion,
which means tomorrow, or
Semeron,
which means today. Seen that in the Lord's Prayer. Ekthes means yesterday. Noon is now, and
Tote,
is then. And so these little temporal indicators, by the way, these adverbs, very interesting, will play a bigger role sometimes in telling us when the verb actually took place than whether it's a present, aorist, or perfect. So you've really got to focus in on these little adverbial words because they are what indicate the actual time of the happening of the verb often, rather than the tense of the verb, which usually, as we've said, should be taken in a more aspectual way than tying tense and time together. So these adverbs will actually shoot the notion of time into the narratives often. Now, adverbs of time, adverbs of manner. Hutos, thus or so, or takeos, quickly, tells the manner in which it took place. It took place quickly. Then you have adverbs of location. Ano, which means above. Kato, which means below. Eke, which means there. and there are several others that indicate location. Now the next 6 screens are kind of going to be word or vocabulary dumps where we list these small words, these conjunctions. And these conjunctions are structural markers in Greek. One must note in Greek, it's the little words that get you, not the big words. The big words like
anthropos
you can recognize and you can pick up easily. But it's the little words in Greek that have so many diverse and various meanings, and also the little words that are critical for indicating the connections of bigger units like clauses, sentences, and even paragraphs, where these little words will indicate how these paragraphs are connected. So while these conjunctions seem like just little words or little buggers, they are really critical if you're going to understand Greek. You really got to pay attention to the little words, these connections, these structural markers. And so our first set of structural markers are the conjunctions of the temporal that indicate time in the flow of the narrative. And this is, we've noticed before, is critical because we've disconnected the tense forms, the present, the aorist, the perfect, the imperfect, the future, etc. We've disconnected those tense forms from equating them with time. So where do you pick up the time in the narrative? It's from these small pointing conjunctions that indicate whether things are before or after or during or when things actually took place. So these are absolutely critical forms to learn in relation to the bigger issues of discourse analysis. So list of words here and for the next 6 screens, and just chill out. You'll get these in the vocabulary, but you just need to pay attention to them. Acri, until. Epe means when. Epeidae means when also. Heos means until.
hote
Which we know means when. And
preen
which we've seen before, means before. So these are just small words that give you some sort of temporal indication of when things are taking place in the sequence of things taking place in your discourse. Now here are some causal structural markers, cause and effect kind of thing. There'll be words like gar, which we've seen, means for this reason.
dioti
Means because. Epe means since. And you say, wait a minute, I thought epe meant when. That's right. In some contexts it indicates temporal. In other contexts it indicates a causal or logical relationship between things. Epe means since.
hoti
Which we've seen a million times already, means because. And so it indicates causals. Hos means since. Epeidae also means since. So you see, some of these words can mean 2, 3, and 4 different things, and that's why these little words are so tricky. So be aware, these are structural markers giving cause, especially
hoti
and gar. You're going to see a lot of those. And on to the purpose structural markers, the markers that give us purpose. Hina, or hina, means in order that, and indicates purpose. Often we've seen hina goes with the subjunctive form.
hopos
Also means in order that. And hos also means in order that as well. You notice that hos also meant since in a causal sense. Here, hos is used in terms of purpose. What is the difference between cause and purpose? We'll look at that in just a minute here. So these are three trigger words that you can use to indicate the purpose of something. The next set of words are continuative structural markers. And we've seen these oftentimes. This is when you want to continue and you add on to a discourse and you want to add one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and the discourse is continuing. He went to the store, then he went to school, and then he went out for dinner, and then he came home. And you've got this continuous sequential nature of narrative. You use these continuative structural markers. And these continuative markers are de, means and or now.
hina,
Means that in a continuative type of way. Kai is our chief, and it's used for the word and is used so many times in the New Testament, the word kai.
hoti,
Also can be taken as that in a continuative type of way. And un means then or now in a continuative sense. And te also means and. These all can then be used to continue the flow of the narrative. The next set of markers are adversative structural markers, and they are used when there's a contrast being made. He went to the store, but he didn't get the milk. There's a contrast going on, so you have these adversative structural markers. Allah, as we've seen already, means but, and it's a major structural marker of contrast. De, also usually used for but can be used for continuative as an and form also. I usually generally start out with de as an adversative and then go to a continuative afterwards. Kai, interestingly enough, can also be used for contrast, usually generically translated and, but in some rare contexts kai can be taken as an adversative. Mentoi also means however. And un can also be taken as however. Both forms adversative. A change in the narrative is happening when you see these words. Now our last screen of these structural markers will just be kind of odds and ends that will often be used, small words, used in the text to connect various paragraphs, sentences, and clauses. Amen means so be it or truly. King James takes as verily, verily, amen, amen. Ara means therefore.
ide,
Means behold.
idu,
Also means behold. Stereotype little words that trigger this idea. Behold, pay attention, emphasis. Men means indeed. And nigh means yes or indeed. I always think it's kind of ironic. We learn to say no, ou or may in Greek, much before we learn to say nigh, which means yes. But I guess that's how we teach our children as well. So these last 6 screens or so give us the structural markers that are going to be critical for understanding how the discourse is connected, how the sentences connect one to another, how the paragraphs connect one to the other. And so these little structural marker words. You've got to really pay attention to them. They'll also indicate the time at which many of the verbs take place. And so they're absolutely critical in the Greek language. It's the little words in Greek that are key to really mastering the language. So pay attention to these structural marker conjunctions. Okay, we want to make a move now away from the morphology of the words, the nouns and the 313 endings, the 212 endings of the adjectives, the verbs and the various primary endings and secondary endings and augments and reduplications, the morphology of how you work with individual word sets and paradigms. We now want to move up to the phrase, and more importantly and focused on this chapter, the clause level. Now, the phrase we've already seen in terms of the prepositional phrase. A phrase is a multiple word unit that lacks a verb. Largely we've seen these as prepositional phrases. A preposition, oftentimes with an article, with a noun or adjective, and a prepositional phrase. In the boat. Clauses now will be a multiple word unit that have a verb or verbal form. And so a clause has a verb and a phrase does not. And so we want to look at some of these clauses now, many of which, the ones that we're looking at currently, will be dependent clauses. That is, you'll need a main clause, then followed by a dependent clause, and this dependent clause cannot function by itself, but will be dependent upon the main clause or main sentence for understanding it. Now, just some more introduction to the clauses. The clause can act as a substitute for a substantive, kind of a nounal thing. You say, I do not have a book. That would be the straight up noun. Or you could say, I do not have what I need. And what I need then would be a clause. It's got a verb in there. I need whatever, so it's got a verb. What I need, but it's functioning as a substantive, a nounal form. I do not have a book. I do not have a car. I do not have what I need. And so what I need is also, do you notice, subordinate. It depends on the rest of the sentence to make sense out of what I need. So that's the clause functioning as a substantive. The clause can also function as an adjective. He bought me the ball which was on the floor. So it's distinguishing which ball he's talking about. So the which was on the floor modifies ball. Just the same way he bought me the red ball, he bought me the ball which is on the floor. Which was on the floor, you'll notice there's a verb in there, which was, and then on the floor indicating the location of the ball. And so it functions as an adjective of location. He bought the ball, you could just say that, and then the ball is modified. Sometimes the clauses then also function adverbially, going back to our discussion on adverbs. And so we will visit when the car is working. The when the car is working tells when we will visit, or gives the temporal kind of modification to when we will visit. Tells the when of the visit. When the car is working. And you'll notice it has a verb, a participle form, when the car is working. And so it's a clause as well, an adverbial clause, functioning as an adverb. So these clauses can function as a substantive, they can function as an adjective, or they can function as an adverb, modifying the time, place, or manner of the verb. Next, let's look at some specific types of clauses then that are typically used in Greek. We won't cover all of them, but I'm just wanting to introduce you to the idea of thinking clausally rather than just thinking at the level of the word. Because context determines meaning, and the bigger context will often determine the meaning of particular words. So we've got to take the discussion of these bigger units very seriously. because they will shape the meaning of the smaller units. All right, let's look first at the purpose clauses. The purpose clause tells the goal or the intention, and it's prospective. In other words, it looks forward, telling a goal or it's a person's intention. Forward-looking. Hasn't happened yet, but it tells the goal, the purpose, or the intention. So, I am going to encourage Zach. To encourage Zach tells why I am going to encourage Zach. That was my purpose. That was my goal. That was my intention. I am going, looking forward to, encouraging Zach. It's in the future. It's forward-looking. It's prospective. Prospective, looking forward. Now, these purpose clauses may be constructed by using infinitives. So, for example, we have
Me nomisete hoti elthon katakusai ton nomon.
do not think
Nomisete
that
hoti
I came,
elthon.
and then here's our purpose clause, katakusai,
Ton nomon.
to destroy the law. In other words, that was not my purpose or my goal. That's not why I came. Looking forward. I came not looking forward, not with the goal or the intention to destroy the law. It's triggered by an infinitive. So the purpose clause is developed by using an infinitive plus an accusative noun as its object. These purpose clauses with goal and intention can also be built from prepositional phrases with the articular infinitive, with ace and
Pros.
so we have poiousin,
Pros to.
theathenai, tois anthropos. They do them. What is the purpose? What is the reason? Looking forward, what was their intention when they went to do these things, to do them? To be seen. Theathenai, to be seen, an infinitive form there with the
Pros to.
with the preposition plus the article plus the infinitive, to be seen by tois anthropos, by men. Tells the intention and purpose and goal. Another way the purpose clause can be formed is with hina and the subjunctive. So we have elthen, then some other things, hina martyrese peri tu photos. He came, then that, why did he come? The purpose, the intention, the goal. He came that he might bear witness concerning peri tu photos, concerning the light. Talking about John the Baptist, his purpose, his intention, his goal in coming. He came that, hina, plus the subjunctive, gives us purpose. Now the causal clause gives the reason why something has happened. Oftentimes is translated because. What is the difference between a purpose clause, then, and a causal clause? The purpose clause is prospective, looking forward to goal and intention for why something was done, looking forward. The causal clause, or the cause clause, is retrospective, that is, it looks back to. It gives a reason for why something was already done. So it's retrospective, it's looking backwards and giving an explanation. He did this because of something. And I think Dan Wallace, who developed this prospective, retrospective distinction there, really is helpful. The difference between a purpose clause and a causal clause. Purpose clause, prospective, intention, goal. Causal clause, retrospective, looking back, giving an explanation for why something was done. A causal clause is formed with a
Hoti.
plus the indicative. So it's translated because, and then with the indicative verb. It can also be triggered by dia plus the infinitive. And so we have again the infinitive functioning as on a clausal level, because. An example of this is
Proskope hoti to uk estin en auto.
he stumbles
Hoti to phos.
because there is no light in him. So what is the reason? Why did he stumble? Looking back, he has already stumbled, but why did he stumble? Because there was no light in him. So it gives an explanation. Looking back to the action of the verb, it explains why something happened. Because there was no light in him.
Hoti to phos uk estin.
This example is a good one because it was obviously not his purpose to stumble, his goal or intention to stumble, but that's what happened, and so it needs an explanation. So the difference between a purpose clause and a causal clause. This one is clearly a causal clause and definitely not a purpose, goal, or intention on his part. Now, result clauses show the results of the main verb. In English, the translation is often close to the meaning of the purpose clause, and sometimes, to be honest, I've had difficulty separating between a purpose clause and a result clause. But the meanings are quite distinct in terms of how you actually think about it, but seeing how they're triggered can sometimes be confusing. Couple trigger words are hoste or hos plus the infinitive. And an example of this would be kai an echo
Pasan tein pistin.
hoste ore methistanai. And if I have all faith, pasan tein piston, so that, with the result that, hoste ore, so as to remove mountains. The result of faith, the removal of mountain. And then you'll notice the infinitive here, mathistanai, is an infinitive, so it's hoste plus the infinitive and the mountain being removed. So as to remove mountains. So the result clause gives us a result, and in this case using the preposition plus the infinitive to give us result. Hoste and hos will be trigger words for these result clauses. Notice once again the importance of these little words, these little trigger words, these structural markers that indicate how the clause is to be understood. And then there are temporal clauses, and we've seen these already with our infinitives and with our participles and the adverbial usages of those. The temporal clause tells the when of the events of the main verb are taking place. So, for example, we have before something took place, that would be antecedent action. After the action of the main verb, that would be subsequent. And during, which would be contemporaneous to the time of the verb. So before, after, and during, antecedent, subsequent, and contemporaneous usages of these temporal clauses. Ironically, the word after I go to the store, I will go home, actually describes antecedent action. And the word before I go to the store, I will go home, describes the before there, describes subsequent action. So you've got to realize that the word after itself on the beginning of a clause actually puts it in an antecedent position, and the word before actually takes the action of that dependent clause and makes it a subsequent. So it kind of flips when you actually get the words after and before. Again, structural little markers can trigger when things are actually taking place. So,
Hote
atelesen,
ho Jesus,
tus lagus, tutus meteren. When Jesus had finished these words, he departed. So this is actually telling us antecedent action. When Jesus finished these words, and notice that atelesen gives us an indication of the when, not from the tense of the verb, but by the very semantics of the word itself, when he had finished these words. So it tells us that this is antecedent action. He did this first. He finished these words, and then he left. So antecedent action triggered by the
hote,
here, plus the verb atelesen. For the next two screens, I just want to discuss the idea of going beyond the word. So far in this course, we focused on particular words and how they're shaped and formed, their morphology, what types of endings we add to nouns, and how that modifies them from singular to plural, how that indicates the different cases, the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, how they have to be matched with their adjectives and match in number, gender, and case. And then also verbs and what kinds of endings, the primary endings, the secondary endings, the augments, the reduplications, and various shiftings of vowels and vowelizations of various consonants with the sigma addition and things. And so we've looked at how words are formed and what the individual words mean, and we've given these simplistic definitions that we've memorized for our vocabulary. But now we want to look beyond the meaning of the word and see the complexity of the language, how you go from words to actually developing literature and something that means something to someone on a level that's higher to the words, how the words intersect with one another. So the second point we want to make is that there's a shift needed at this point in the course, and we don't ever want you to forget how to parse and how to deconstruct a word down to its endings and its case and its tense and its person, all those things. You need to know that, and any kind of literary reading assumes that you do know that. So what we've done in the course has been foundational and it's been critical upon which to build a really good understanding of the Greek language at higher levels. But be careful as you move up to the higher levels too, that you don't trash the foundation upon which those higher levels are built. So we want to move from the word level then up to the phrases and clauses. And in this chapter we've explored different types of clauses. The purpose clause, the causal clause, the result clause, the temporal clause, locational clause. And we've looked at different clauses and how they function to modify sentences, how they function to modify verbs, etc. You can also then move beyond the clausal level up to the sentence level. In other words, what role does this sentence play in the paragraph? And as you've learned in English, to write a paragraph, you structure a paragraph in a certain way. And you build that structure using sentences. And the sentences, of course, are built with words, phrases, and clauses. So the sentences then combine into paragraphs. And the paragraphs then, if you've written any papers, you've realized that a good paper has to have good paragraph structure. In other words, you start out with an introduction, you develop your points in different paragraphs, your first point, and then you develop a paragraph about that, your second point, you develop that through a paragraph, the third point, a paragraph to develop that, and then you come to a concluding paragraph in which you draw together the strings of the thesis that you're trying to make. And so the paragraphs then, they have relationships to one another as well. And then finally, the whole story comes together then, being made of words, phrases, clauses, sentences into paragraphs, paragraphs into whole stories or discourses. And these discourses then, these various stories, say of Jesus walking on the water or feeding the 5,000, these stories then are put together into a book and into an epistle. And the whole book then has a meaning, a purpose of why it was written. And so the paragraphs form discourses, and the discourses end up forming units like epistles and books. And so you can see how the whole language is structured then, from morphemes on the end of nouns to verbs and word forms, to clauses and phrases, to sentences, to paragraphs, on up to discourses, and eventually into canonical books. So in the whole thing, there's this hierarchical relationship that builds up by which a writer builds his or her story. Now, another factor that we need to take into account is the style of each writer. And each writer will have a different background and come then with a different style. So John, for example, a fisherman from Galilee, will write in a different way than Luke, say, who's a doctor and a very well-educated person from Asia Minor. The location that a person is from will determine whether he says ka or whether he says car. So some will say idea and others will say idea. Or whether he says wash or whether they say wash. Is it pop or is it soda? Or is it soda pop? And so the location from which a person comes from, as well as their background, will affect how they write. So we have to note the style of each writer, as well as the literary genre that they're using. The literary genre is an epistle. We would expect them to start out saying, grace to you and peace from God our Father, etc., like that. And end then with greetings to the people that they're writing it to. If it's a historical narrative, we would expect more a story about, may start with a genealogy or something, of the person that's being described. So a gospel, for example, is very different in many ways than an epistle. In apocalyptic literature, you've got all these beasts and creatures running around and heavenly scenes and angels and stuff flying here and there and dragons and things. That apocalyptic literature is going to be very different than an epistle, which he's addressing specific problems in a church. And sermonic material, as you get in the book of Acts, and say Stephen goes off on a sermon is going to be very differently constructed than an epistle, than a historical narrative, and certainly than apocalyptic literature. So you've got to take into account in the understanding of each individual word how they function in the literary genre that it's being written. Is the story written as a fiction, or is it written as a historical narrative? I think that's been some of the problem with things like the Da Vinci Code. It comes off as explicitly saying it's fiction, but implicitly there seems to be a deeper subtext that indicates that this is actually what this fellow believes actually historically happened. Continuing our discussion of thinking outside the word box, there's a kind of a heuristic nature, and I think one fellow described it as a hermeneutical spiral, where you go back and forth on the different levels. In other words, you've got individual words and they mean certain things generally. You use the context then to eliminate the higher order things of what type of literature it's being discussed in. You use the higher level orders to help refine the meaning of particular words. And then the refining meaning of the particular words impact then how you understand the bigger units. And so there's this back and forth that takes place as you go start with the words, you build up to phrases, sentences, paragraphs, and discourses, and then your discourses then impact how your paragraphs are understood. Your paragraphs impact how your sentences are understood, and your sentences impact how those individual words are understood. And then the words, on the other hand, goes back the other way, impact how the sentence is understood, how the paragraph, how the discourse. And so it goes back and forth, and you have this heuristic method. And so you just can't grab a word and try to define what it means outside of its context. You've got to work with the context. The context is shaped by the individual words, and the individual words are shaped by the context at all levels. And so there's this interactivity that goes up and down the levels, and you need to transverse that up the ladder and then down the ladder several times, actually sometimes, in order to distinguish the meaning of particular words, sentences, paragraphs, and discourses. So we won't take a unilateral kind of way, starting with words as a building block. like a brick that you build a house with, but it's much more interactive, much more like a network where one machine interacts with the other machine, and then they go back and forth, and then you negotiate, and then it functions more like a network. And one final thing we should add into this, that we've really been negligent on doing this, as actually this is a Greek grammar course that basically works with words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, pronouns, and things like that. We're building the foundation. But once you move beyond this level, you need to start taking into account culture and how culture impacts how things are understood. Things like idioms, figures of speech, which you can't derive actually literally to take for what something means, but you've got to understand things as figurative. Various rhetorical devices also need to be accounted for in terms of your meaning. Many of the objects will have certain meanings in certain cultures that are not found in our culture. And so you've got to become aware of those cultures and how they think about certain objects. They think about certain objects, they think about certain activities very differently than we do. And so you've got to come to grips with that. If you're going to understand the meaning of texts, you've got to understand how culture impacts meaning. And then lastly, you've got to work with how our particular text that we're examining interacts with other texts. And so there will be these echoes that you'll hear from the Old Testament. So a Jewish person writing in the first century, and there'll be all these echoes that come in from the Old Testament that they've been steeped in. And so they understand these things from an Old Testament background, and if we don't have that background, we miss the point oftentimes. And then you've got to understand the various cultural items of the day. A Pharisee or a Sadducee or a Herodian or a Zealot may use the same types of phraseologies, but in very, very different ways, given the fact of the party that they're from. So you've got to understand the culture, and you've got to understand the interactivity of the particular text that's being examined with other texts, both from that time and that culture, and also from preceding biblical texts, in this case the Old Testament and the Septuagint in particular. So it's kind of fun, the language, while you can master the Greek language, this understanding of how culture impacts things, how other texts impact other things, how the discourses impact words and things like that, gives you enough to play with for the rest of your life. And second year Greek will obviously sharpen your skills then at these other levels. But don't forget the morphology, the basic level that we've learned of parsing and how to take words apart. We need that as a good foundation, but then we move up to these other levels, particularly in second year Greek. You've got to be really careful after first year Greek of thinking that you are now the master of Greek. I'm really reticent when I hear somebody who has had first year Greek saying, in the Greek this means, and I just think it's awful deceptive because frankly, we've worked at the word level now, and unless you've done these other levels and interact with the culture of the time in intertextuality, and you've worked with higher order thinking here, we really don't know, and it's very presumptuous to say, in the Greek it means. And so I often think people use that in the Greek it means to hide authoritatively behind this knowledge. In other words, I know, you don't know because you don't know Greek. And I wish oftentimes you just tell it to people in English the way you understand it and realize that it's your understanding of the text. And we should say, does your way of doing life and who you are and where you've come from impact how you interpret these words? Surely they do. And so the reader as well as the author impacts how you understand these words. And therefore be careful about pontificating that this is what this text means. This is your interpretation of what it means. And that depends on your culture and where you've come from and how you've understood things and your research and your skills in Greek. And after first year Greek, we're okay at the word level and things, but you realize the word level can't really be determined until you work on these other things. And so I just caution you, And I guess the word I'd like to leave with you is the word humility. That having studied Greek, don't use it to lord it over other people, but you use it in a humble way to explore the Word of God and understand it the best way you can. And thankfully, God has spoken, and it is great delight and privilege to explore His Word. But don't confuse His Word with your word. The vocabulary for Chapter 27. The first word is
duo,
and it means two. The second word is dodeca, and it means 12. The third word is heis mia hen, and it means one. The fourth word is
hecaton,
and it means 100. The fifth word is heptah, and it means 7. The sixth word is medes, medemia, meden, and it means no one or no. The seventh word is oudes, oudemia, ouden, and it means no or no one. The eighth word is penta, and it means 5. The ninth word is tres, tria, and it means 3. And the 10th word is kilias, and it means 1,000.